trade practice document has that available. It is available for respective members of NABCA and NCSLA through nabca.org and NCSLA.org. Some housekeeping before we begin. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact Citrix customer service directly at 855-352-9002. That's 855-352-9002, and give them webinar ID number 104-205-379. That's webinar ID number 104-205-379. So we expect this webinar to last about 1 hour with room for question and answer at the end. If there are a lot of questions and if attendees don't mind, we may stay on a little longer. Please know that once the webinar begins, I'm not able to acknowledge receipt of questions, but know that Pam will answer questions at the end. If you have a question, please type it in the chat window in the lower right corner of your screen. At the end of the presentation, I will ask the questions on your behalf. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later through nabca.org. You will find it under the Resources tab. Just look for webinars in the drop-down list that appears. So I'm going to introduce Pam Erickson, our speaker for today. Pam is a passionate leader on alcohol issues. Currently, she owns Public Action Management, which operates an education campaign for a healthy alcohol marketplace. From 1996 to 2003, she directed the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, which included operating the Oregon's distilled spirits business. From 2003 to 2007, she worked at the Oregon Partnership to direct leadership and media campaigns to reduce underage drinking. Her education campaign is designed to explain the purpose and objectives of alcohol regulation in simple terms. She has developed several reports on deregulation in the United Kingdom and the U.S. and annually produces a report for policymakers called Issue Briefs. These reports explain how deregulation can lead to increased social problems such as high rates of underage drinking, public order offenses, and alcohol-related diseases. Recently, she launched a series of short reports. The latest one is number 3, Fair Trade Practice Regulations. Pam has also served as an expert witness in key alcohol regulation cases in Kentucky and California. Her educational materials are available at healthyalcoholmarket.com. So I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Pam, and I would appreciate your patience with some possible technical difficulties that we may experience. So Pam, I've just changed the presenter to you. If you can pull up your PowerPoint so that we can see your screen and begin the presentation.
Okay, Maggie. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this very important but somewhat complex area. Maggie, do you have my screen up?
I do not see your screen. I see the welcome screen.
How about now?
No, I don't see that. I don't see your screen either. What I may have to do is just take the control back and run through the slides on my side.
How about now?
Nope, still no.
Okay, well then I think that maybe you'll need to do the slides.
Yeah, let me take it back. So can you see this?
I can.
Okay,
yes.
Great. So I'll drive the bus, if you will.
Okay. first, let me talk about the objectives of this webinar. And I want to talk a little bit about why these are important. Honesty and fair dealing have always been a critical factor in alcohol regulation. And I think you can see it today as states are attempting to legalize marijuana. It's very important to have people who are in the business, who are honest, who play fairly, and things are pretty transparent. That is just as important in alcohol sales. But oftentimes we hear a lot of criticisms of fair trade practice laws in alcohol. They're called Prohibition-era regulations, not relevant today. They just get in the way of business. People say that alcohol is a, quote, legal product, unquote, and therefore should be sold without regulation. Alcohol regulation should be aimed at the public, at public safety, and these laws, in a lot of people's opinions, have nothing to do with public health and safety. But these things are not true. Originally, these laws were developed with an eye for public health and safety, and they are very important, but they're unfortunately poorly understood. So I've developed this webinar and a report on these issues to try to simplify this so people can have an understanding. And I am reminded that in my 7 years as a regulator, I only had a vague understanding of these laws. And I have come to believe they're very important, but they're really hard for people to use and understand. But I want to go back in history and explain why we have them, how they came about, and what they are designed to do. Next slide. It begins with before Prohibition. Before Prohibition, we had huge problems with alcohol. If you look at history, you find that Americans were very heavy drinkers. In 1830, Americans drank an average of 7 gallons of pure alcohol compared to 2.3 today. And regulation was basically non-existent. We really didn't have much in the way of regulation. Alcohol was sold primarily in bars called saloons, and were virtually all what was called tied house, which meant that they were really owned by a national supplier. So a national supplier would be a big beer company, a big spirits company, a large enterprise that supplied alcohol products, and they would then own a string of retail operations called saloons. And each of these saloons could only sell that particular supplier's product. And so each national manufacturer or supplier had to have a separate saloon in many, many communities. It was amazing how many saloons we had, even in very small communities. Competition was really fierce, and there were a lot of methods used to induce people to buy as much alcohol as humanly possible. Gambling, prostitution, special deals. People could pledge their paycheck, and at the end of the month, there often wasn't much to take home. This spawned very heavy drinking problems and became a major social issue. Public disorder, intoxication, addiction, family wages squandered, prostitution, gambling, all of those were huge problems. And they led to a fairly extreme solution, which was prohibition. Next. After Prohibition, those who were involved in establishing regulations really had in mind that they did not want the market conditions to return that had spawned the social problems. And at the side of the screen, there's a quote from a book called Toward Liquor Control. It was a book that displayed the results of a long-term study of alcohol regulatory systems throughout the world. It was called Toward Liquor Control by Fosdick and Scott. And in this book, you find this quote: "The Tide House system had all the vices of absentee ownership. The manufacturer knew nothing and cared nothing about the community. All he wanted was increased sales. He saw none of the abuses, and as a non-resident, he was beyond local social influence." That's actually why you see in some states they have residency laws, because they don't want the problem of the absentee owner who cares only about sales. And as a regulator, I can tell you that it's a lot easier to deal with a licensee that's in your state versus someone that is actually a national operator, or even today a global operator with a headquarters outside the country. So after Prohibition, the 21st Amendment gave the primary duty of regulation to the states. There is some federal regulation, but the primary responsibility is with the states. And as you saw, Prohibition was a federal response, a one-size-fits-all. There's a recognition that didn't work very well, that we need to allow some variation by state. Toward Liquor Control really provided a blueprint for how to regulate. And you have to recognize that states really didn't know anything about regulation. They didn't really have any experience with it. Before Prohibition, there was very little regulation. And of course, during Prohibition, it was a completely unregulated market. But those who were involved in the task of developing regulations vowed that the market practices that fueled alcohol problems would never return. And this led to a comprehensive regulatory system that's really unique in the world, and actually pretty effective in terms of curbing consumption and problems. And it has several mechanisms. One is a three-tiered system of licensure. Fair trade practice regulations, and a license system. To use a football analogy, everybody seems to use football analogies these days, the three-tiered system is the structure. Like a football field with boundaries and lines, the trade practice regulations are like the rule book. All licensed business must follow state and federal rules. And just like referees, state and federal agency employees are there to enforce the regulations. The three-tiered system, again, is unique in the world. There are a few other places that have three-tiered systems, but most don't. It is a regulatory structure of closed product sale. So a manufacturer has to be licensed. They can only sell their product to a licensed distributor who can only sell the product to a licensed retailer. Each system is usually required to be independent of the other. The three-tier system is designed to prevent what's called vertical integration, which is a form of monopoly where the manufacturer and the supplier, the manufacturer, supplier, and retailer are basically one business or one business arrangement, and they can dominate the market and use whatever sales tactics they can get away with through that. But there are two other benefits of this system that are not well known, but they're really valuable. One is that we have very safe products. In other countries, you often see stories about people dying from illegal tainted alcohol. That almost never happens in our country because of this closed system. And it is the distributor's job to track every bottle and can, and when there's any kind of problem, it's relatively easy to quickly pull these products from the shelf so that no customers are hurt. The second benefit is very high tax collections. In other countries, they lose a third to a half of the potential revenue through leakages in the system. We have almost no leakage and close to 100% tax collections. So there are a couple of kind of unknown benefits of our system. Fair trade practice regulations, I've divided them into 5 types. Financial ties, sometimes called tied house laws, exclusive outlet or business arrangements, commercial bribery, consignment sales, and fair or uniform pricing. Now we'll deal with each of those in some detail. Laws prohibiting financial ties or things of value. There are tied house laws in federal and state law. Basically, they prohibit ties between the tiers involving ownership, investment, loans, or providing things of value. Now, each state will have their own set of laws, and while there may be variations on a theme, each state does have different laws, but they all, to some degree or another, regulate things of value. Again, because these kinds of ties between a manufacturer, distributor, and retailer lead to vertical integration. You should understand that financial ties are a common business practice with other products. The soda aisle, for example, usually has one type of, only a couple of different products. But let's go on to the next one. Exclusive business arrangements. This prohibits favorable business deals, and it's usually a price break offered to one retailer or to a group of retailers, but not to everyone. And it usually involves buying less product from a competitor. Exclusive deals are very common with other commodities. Sometimes you'll go to a particular venue and they will only have Coke products or Pepsi products. I've always thought it was curious when you go to a restaurant and order a Coke and they say, will Pepsi be okay? That means they have an exclusive arrangement with Pepsi to only sell Pepsi products and not Coke products. And likely they got that exclusive arrangement through some sort of price break. So these are common and not illegal with other commodities, but it is not, generally speaking, a legal practice with alcohol. And interestingly enough, this practice, these laws have actually fostered a flourishing craft beer business in the U.S., whereas craft beer can't get to market in many other countries. And this is what happens. Mexico is a good example where most retailers have an exclusive agreement with one of the 2 large beer companies. And craft products simply can't get into a store or a bar because of those exclusive arrangements. Mexico's Competition Commission ruled that some of those are illegal. That was just a couple of years ago. So the craft beer industry in Mexico has had a very hard time getting anywhere with their products. Next. Commercial bribery is pretty much what it sounds like. It's cash or gifts or gift cards that are given to the owner or one of the employees. Sometimes it's surreptitiously to an employee. But obviously there is a trade-off. I'll give you this gift, and then I expect that you promote my products over others, that you give my products some sort of special treatment. Next one, consignment sales. Consignment sales represents an incomplete sale and tends to perpetually tie the retailer with the supplier. It's incomplete because the retailer can return unsold products, but it often results in a situation where the retailer is kind of pushed into ordering more product than they really can sell, and oftentimes then the retailer is pressured into fire selling it, and bumping up consumption. So that's kind of what consignment sales are. And finally, we have pricing. Fair pricing regulations. The federal alcohol laws do not have pricing laws, but there are federal pricing laws. For example, the federal Robinson-Packman Act does require fair pricing. So a supplier of really any commodity is supposed to give the same price to similarly situated retailers. In state law, there are states that have what's called a uniform pricing law or a ban on price discrimination. And basically it means that distributors are supposed to offer their whole bank of products at the same price to everybody. Now some states allow what's called channel pricing. Arizona, for example, has a two-channel pricing system. So the distributor has to offer the same price to all those that are off-premise retailers, the stores and that kind of thing. They can have a different price structure for the bars, taverns, restaurants, which are called on-premise channel. But that's it. It's only two sets of prices, and within those categories, they have to offer the same price to everybody. This reduces the incentive to sell at discount. And it's particularly important for local communities because if large companies are able to sell at deep discount, it can squeeze them out of business and eventually dominate the market. Next. There are a lot of exceptions to these laws, and this is why. Let me give you a little background on it. There is certainly a legitimate need for advertising and promotion of products. All three segments of the alcohol industry now have a lot of new products, and sometimes a third to a half of all their revenue comes from new products. If you can't advertise a new product, no one will even know to buy it. So advertising is really critical. A second thing that's happened is that the advertising business has dramatically changed. It used to be that you would advertise products in major media, TV, radio, or print. Well, those have all changed. With TV and radio stations are now in the hundreds, and the print media has dramatically changed. So it's very difficult to use major media anymore, and it's very, very costly. It's very hard to target your specific customer base through major media anymore. So advertising and promotion of alcohol products has moved in store, in the bar, or into events. And so it's really quite different. And oftentimes you get into situations where in order to promote and advertise an event, for example, you're going to get into a things of value kind of quagmire. So it's important to try to conceptualize and separate out those things that are really legitimate advertising and promotion activities versus just trying to buy your way into a market through favors and special deals and that kind of thing. Next. So what happens when trade practice regulations are violated? If you have a single instance of somebody providing a thing of value to a tavern in a remote location, it only happens once, that's unlikely to create social problems. It's when these things go on and become very widespread, then you have a dramatic change in your marketplace, and it's very difficult to get it back on, get back into a balanced marketplace situation. So continued use of discounts and freebies eventually tie the retailer to the supplier, and the pressure for increased sales continues. So it's important to remember that these freebies are not just free. They come with an expectation that you, retailer, are going to favor my product in some way. You're going to use the discounted purchase price to drop your prices and induce greater sales of my product. And as more and more retailers get involved in these kinds of things, then you have a huge amount of people that are attempting to boost sales, and eventually social problems will follow and they will become very widespread. It's also important to remember that usually these price breaks aren't for your local mom and pop. They're for the big venues that are really going to juice up sales. So your small operators will be at a great disadvantage. And eventually you'll have a market dominated by just a few players. Next. So let's look at a couple of examples of what happens when you have trade practice violations. And example one, it involves a supplier in a large bar that agreed to host an event which will feature the supplier's products. The supplier will provide discounted product and a fairly high volume of that because they expect a lot of attendees. They'll pay for event advertising, they'll pay for event entertainment, either a band, a popular band, or a DJ, and they'll pay for things like extra seating, extra drink sessions, promotional signs, and that kind of thing. And let's say that this event goes on as expected. It drew large crowds and major sales, but oftentimes when you have large crowds and increased sales, especially discounted drinks and that kind of thing, you also get fights, DUIs, neighborhood disturbance, and extra law enforcement is required. Now, as a regulator, I know that it's possible to manage a large bar really well so you don't have a lot of problems, but it's a very difficult management task. And I have seen really good bars get quickly out of control when they change management or the manager decides to take a long vacation. It's a tough job. So that's what can happen when you have a single supplier that colludes with the retailer and puts on a large event. And the fact is that for most states, supplying advertising, extra stuff, discounted product, all of those things are illegal practices. Let's look at a second example, and let's just kind of continue this scenario. And suppliers B and C, they noticed that this particular event that was sponsored by supplier A was very successful. It got large sales, and so they decide they're going to do the same thing, and they work with several other bars for more events. Large crowds are now at several venues. There are many more drunk patrons. Fighting, littering, intoxication require major police and ER services. In the UK and in some US bar districts, this actually happens every weekend with a great deal of regularity. In Scottsdale, Arizona, we have a large bar district, and it has been the subject of lots of controversy, and the city council has adopted new ordinances, changed a lot of security measures, trying to get the whole thing under control. So you really don't want these kinds of venues to get out of control. And one way to do it is to be pretty tough on trade practice violations. Next. The United Kingdom is a modern example of how market conditions can create social problems. At one time, the United Kingdom had a very good set of alcohol regulations. In fact, they were a model for a lot of our what we call licensed states that licensed everyone that sold alcohol. But beginning in the 1950s, they slowly deregulated over about 50 to 60 years to the point where virtually anybody can sell alcohol. Alcohol is available in grocery stores, convenience stores, bars, pubs, taverns, restaurants. And closing hours are kind of a thing of the past. You can literally buy alcohol 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, although they've started clamping down on extended hours in some communities. But big box grocery stores have come to completely dominate the alcohol market. There are 4 large grocery chains that really have captured about 70% of the what's called off-premise market. And they've done it by striking deals with suppliers. They work directly with suppliers and buy in very high volume at very cheap prices. And they often use alcohol as a loss leader to bring in patrons into their store. They've even affected the on-premise market because alcohol is so much cheaper in grocery stores that customers have a few drinks at home before they go out to the bars. And it's called pre-drinking. It's become very popular. And bar districts have gotten really out of control. This photo is from the United Kingdom, and many of the entertainment districts are so out of control that law enforcement advises citizens not to go there because they're too dangerous. So, but the UK has an alcohol epidemic, much more drinking than in the US, high rates of underage drinking, public drunkenness, and huge health problems. Even if you were to clamp down and really be successful in cutting back on heavy drinking, you would still have problems because health problems take many years to develop in some cases. And so you would see several years of continuing health problems even if you were able to instantly curtail things. Next. So what does research say about alcohol regulations? I recommend 2 sources for research. One is the Centers for Disease Control Community Prevention Task Force that reviews credible research and based on those reviews make recommendations of alcohol policies that are effective. The World Health Organization is also a good source for identifying effective alcohol regulations. And both those organizations recommend as effective regulations that impact the price of alcohol. So really cheap alcohol induces consumption and social problems. Reasonably balanced prices are really kind of the way to go. Aggressive promotions and numbers of outlets are also other factors in inducing alcohol problems. It is also important to remind people why we regulate alcohol. We seem to be in a period of kind of apathy about alcohol harm. The CDC estimates that we have 88,000 deaths annually due to alcohol, and that's from all causes: crashes, poisonings, liver cirrhosis, other kinds of diseases that are alcohol-induced. And despite the progress we've made on underage drinking, it's still unacceptably high. We have made great progress on this. We've made progress on drunk driving, but it's still unacceptably high. Alcohol is also a causal factor in crime, domestic problems, and other social problems. It's important to remember that we lose about 10,000 people a year due to drunk driving. So we haven't completely solved this problem. We've made great progress, and we need to continue it. It's important to understand that if a new product came onto the market that had this much social harm, we would be it would engender mass hysteria. We'd be ripping these products off the shelf. So it's important to remind people that alcohol can cause great harm, and regulations are actually effective in reducing the harm. Now let's talk a little bit about the marketplace, because a lot of the arguments today are about the free market and that we need to modernize our regulations. They're meant for a different era. I would say to you that monopoly and marketplace domination is just as much a threat today as it was in former times, if not more. This chart is it comes from the National Beer Wholesalers Association, but you can see that the marketplace concentration for beer has increased, and the top two companies have about 70% of the market share. And both of those companies are currently in talks to merge. Anheuser-Busch has a proposal to merge with Miller-Coors. Whether they will have that combined market share will depend on regulators who will probably require that they divest some of the resources so they are not so dominant, but still it is daunting to think that so much of the market share is just in a couple of companies. Next. First of all, let's talk about the free market myth. The United States does not really have a free market for any food, drink, or drug product. They are all regulated for public health and safety. And certainly you would not want to have no regulations at all for things that we ingest. Too many products as it is get through those screens and cause serious problems, such as the ice cream that had some tainted products. We had a spinach crisis. It's really important to regulate these products for public health and safety. So selling alcohol in an actual free market isn't really a helpful discussion because we don't have it, and it's unlikely that we ever will. So what should we talk about? Next slide. Well, our marketplaces are not free of regulation. They really do try to give consumers some of the benefits of a market economy. One is which prices are set by supply and demand, where for example, a new product has to prove itself in the marketplace by people buying it because they like it, not because there's been some deal that makes it so cheap that people buy that even though they would prefer to buy a different product. So a balanced marketplace allows prices to be set by supply and demand, and that works its magic in the marketplace. A second thing that our regulations try to do is limit barriers to limit the barriers to new businesses and new products. This ensures a wide variety of products. It allows large and small companies to operate with a reasonable profit. In other countries, it's very common to allow exclusive arrangements. For example, in Mexico, up until a couple of years ago, all retailers bought beer from one of two companies, and the company that they bought from, it was an exclusive arrangement. They were precluded from buying any other products. As a result, craft operators, craft beer companies just couldn't get their product to market in Mexico, and it really couldn't get a foothold. That obviously hasn't happened in this country, where we now have 4,000 breweries and another 1,600 in the pipeline. We have a flourishing craft beer business. We have a very vigorous distilled spirits craft business, and of course the wine business has a lot of large and small operators. By limiting the barriers such as exclusive arrangements, you allow a lot of products, they have a fair chance of making it in the marketplace. And it provides robust competition and a local market in your community where there are a variety of products, new products, and a rich local commercial sector with profitable large and small businesses. Ironically, a free market often requires government intervention because companies sort of naturally move toward monopoly or dominance of one or more large companies. You just need to go to your commercial sector in your community and see the dominance of large box stores in home improvement, in the drug business, in other kinds of business where there are really only a couple of very large companies. And eventually, as this moves along, customers and consumers will lose the benefits of a market economy. Markets generally don't have a mechanism to prevent dangerous products, so that's a very critical element of our regulations. For these reasons, many countries have an antitrust or competition commission that can wade into the marketplace when things get out of balance and set them right again. The U.S. has both federal and state antitrust laws, although sometimes enforcement is sort of lax. It's interesting to note that fair trade practice regulations are common legal concepts that prevent anti-competitive practices. A lot of times these laws are criticized for being antiquated, meant for another era, and yet we find the same concepts in antitrust legislation. At the federal level, the primary law keeping businesses competitive is the Sherman Antitrust Law, which has several business practices which are considered to be anti-competitive. Price discrimination, that tends to create a monopoly. You remember we talked about uniform pricing laws, and this same concept shows up in federal antitrust law. Exclusive dealing agreements, tying arrangements. These are also business practices that have been deemed anti-competitive by the Sherman Antitrust Law. Mergers and acquisitions are what we usually think of when we think of antitrust organizations, but they're only part of it. So it's important to help people understand that these aren't oddball laws. They're very common in antitrust legislation. And arguably, alcohol products have more of a free market than other commodities. And you know that in most parts of our country, large national chains dominate our local retail markets. In large grocery stores, suppliers usually have to pay a slotting fee to get their product on the shelf. Basically, they're buying their way into a market. And if you want a favorable slot, which is usually at eye level or on an end of an aisle, you have to pay extra for that. Product choice is very limited. Just go and look at the soda aisle, and you will find basically Coke and Pepsi products. Rarely do you see anything that's a local soft drink company. My question was, are there even any? I couldn't name one if you asked me. So product choice is very limited, and the large chain can really prevent new products from coming on the market. Large chains also can undercut your small operators. So small local businesses have a very hard time competing with the large enterprises. Trade practice laws are difficult to enforce. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And so I want to talk a little bit about enforcement. A lot of times to find a trade practice violation, you have to engage in complex financial analysis, and oftentimes your enforcement staff is not trained to do that. So you may be at sort of a handicap. You may have a staff shortage. When I was a regulator, I had 1/2 of one person dedicated to trade practice regulations. So if we had a big case, we would have been very handicapped in trying to handle that. You have a lot of reluctant complainants and witnesses. I would get complaints about trade practice violations, but the complainant invariably would say, you can never tell where you got this information. So I not only had someone who was reluctant to complain, but would never serve as a witness. So it's very hard to make a case. And then, of course, you have a lot of pressure to be, quote, business friendly. And I think that on that last point, it's really important to have fairness in our marketplaces because you don't want to give some advantage, marketplace advantage, to a cheater. What about all those honest licensees that play by the rules day after day and yet get undercut on price because they won't engage in unfair trade practices? So it's important to understand why why you do enforcement of these laws. I would suggest that you consider a comprehensive enforcement program. Obviously, the cheapest and way of enforcing laws is education. It's true that a lot of people in the industry really aren't fully familiar with a lot of these laws. In Arizona, there was a major investigation with widespread trade practice violations, and they came to realize that in many cases the retailer was completely ignorant of trade practice regulations and were engaging in things that they thought were actually legal. It's really important to educate your licensees in order to achieve voluntary compliance. And if you haven't done an education effort for 5 years, you probably need to do one because in those 5 years there's been major changeover in staff, in companies, and lots of other things. You might want to consider something like random audits or gaining some capability to do what's called forensic accounting. So you have people who can understand various financial documents. It's always helpful when you do enforcement actions to eventually publicize these things because it does increase the deterrent effect. Regular communication is really important. Once you do some basic education, following that up with some kind of memo or information or even meetings semi-annually or quarterly is always a good idea because it keeps these issues up on the radar screen and I think will help deterrence. And periodically it would be wise to streamline and simplify your regulations to enhance understanding and compliance. Laws always get more complex as the years pass, and as legislators attempt to accommodate new ways of doing things, and periodically you really need to simplify these things so that they're more effective. So I would recommend that also. When you're doing an enforcement action or responding to a complaint, a couple of things in your thought process might be helpful. One is, what's the motivation? Is somebody attempting to buy their way into a marketplace? They're just throwing money around, or are they trying to engage in legitimate advertising and promotion? So it's helpful to understand the motivation and then look at if this is really a promotional event. Is it within the boundaries of your laws? Another thing is oftentimes the question is, did the supplier or distributor provide things of value? And it's helpful to look at, to kind of categorize those things. There are some things where they're just never legal. If a supplier is providing TV sets, furniture, gift cards, those just aren't ever legal. And so that you can focus on those things that may or may not be legal depending on whether they've crossed the boundaries of, say, a monetary limit. A lot of times states will say you can provide X number of signs, but there are only 3. Or you can provide something that doesn't exceed a monetary value of $100. So those kinds of things will hopefully make your job a little easier. It's important to look at third-party benefits, such as advertising and entertainment, to see whether the supplier has a connection with those and is really paying for them for the benefit of the retailer or the event that's being put on. So it's important to look at those things. And again, while the investigation may be difficult and tedious, it's important to persist because cheaters hurt the good licensee who follows the rules. And it would be really sad to see some of these good licensees go out of business because they refuse to cheat. Finally, in conclusion, our fair trade practice regulations are not antiquated, but they help maintain a balanced marketplace that provides a lot of benefits for our consumers and our businesses. The U.S. does not have a completely free market for any food or drink product, so these arguments are not really very helpful because they're simply not relevant. Trade practice regulations can be divided into 5 categories: financial ties, exclusive contracts, commercial bribery, consignment sales, and pricing practices. And then exceptions allow, within those categories, reasonable retail promotions. Trade practice violations, if they go on, almost always involve social problems, even in a single premise, but especially in areas, entertainment districts, where there are a lot of bars and they're all doing trade practice violations. And again, while enforcement may be difficult, a multi-pronged program using education, communication, audits, investigation can increase compliance. And finally, rules are different in every state. So industry members must become knowledgeable about the rules in whichever state they operate. And I'm going to give you some resources. Where to find the rules. Sometimes that's not easy. But we have a new resource that's designed to help you out. That resource is a catalog of state regulations done in a cooperative venture by the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association and the National Conference of State Liquor Administrators. They worked together and developed a large questionnaire and have cataloged all those states that responded. And while it's a large publication, it's organized by state. So you can go to the state that you're working in, and then you can go to the category and find out about their laws. Some states do have comprehensive information on trade practices, either in a booklet or on their website. So you should always check with your state alcohol beverage control organization. And there are a few states that do not have a state alcohol agency or a very small state alcohol agency. For example, in Nevada, there is no state alcohol agency. Everything's done at the local level, except for trade practices, which are enforced by the Nevada Attorney General's office. So it's important to find out who does what. Then I would like to offer my website. All of my publications are there, available for download, and it's free. I have a new short report on fair trade practice regulation. And I have a monthly newsletter. You can sign up for that. Again, it's free. I have educational pieces, PowerPoint presentations. I also have a publication called Issue Briefs. I publish this every year for 2016. I will revise it. And it has, these are a collection of 1 or 2 pages on single topics. I have about 16 different topics that I have simple explanations. And they're designed really for policymakers and people that don't have a lot of time to read anything extensively. Also, my legal expert reports are on my website. In the Maxwell Pickpack versus Daner case, it was a Kentucky case. It has a major discussion of why large grocery chains want to sell all forms of alcohol in their stores in lightly regulated environments. Anyway, that's free for download on the website. And here are some websites that you can check and how to go about checking them for your information. So I would be ready to take questions.
Okay, Pam, thank you very much for your presentation. We do have some questions. We are at almost the top of the hour, so hope folks can bear with us for just a short while. Again, handful of questions for you. Pam, the first one is, can you clarify the limitations or regulations applied to consignment sales?
I'm not an expert in that area. Basically, it prohibits sales that are really conditional. One of the key elements to alcohol sales is they have to be complete sales. And in many cases, you know, states that have cash laws that you have to pay immediately or within a few days. And that's designed to prevent some long-term relationship between a supplier and a retailer. Consignment sales are basically incomplete sales where you can return the product, for example, if it doesn't sell, and that kind of thing.
Okay. Next question. Is private label a gray area, for example, a retailer owning a label?
That is kind of, it may be a gray area. It's a kind of unaddressed area. I have a short report on private labels, and it's available on my website. In my opinion, a branded private label product, from what I can tell, is not legal. But I'm not a lawyer, and I've posed that question to the federal alcohol authorities, and I haven't got any kind of answer. So I don't really know. I think that's an area where I suggested that the feds issue an advisory, because there are some situations where it may or may not be legal. I don't think we know very much about it.
Okay. And another question here. It says, we are in the process of setting up a comprehensive enforcement program, but need related referrals and resources. Where can I find sample programs or elements of programs, for example, education, audits, communications, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay. The state of Arizona, you can talk to, you know, maybe Lee Hill is their communication director, and you might start with her. Craig Miller used to, and he may still do, I'm not really sure, but he was in charge of a long, involved investigation of trade practice violations. And after they reached a settlement agreement and issued fines, they part of the settlement agreement involved an education program and a commitment to have your staff attend some regular, I think they were quarterly meetings. And so that's a state where they really have attempted to do more with enforcement, and they have a very small staff. So, you know, things like that can be done. I know that the state of Washington, before they privatized and deregulated, had a large trade practice staff, and they still have quite a few trade practice regulations. And so the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board might be a resource for some expertise there. Also, in the state of Massachusetts, they just, they're actually in the middle of a significant investigation, and I think they would be a good source of advice. Ted Mahoney is the person that was in charge of the investigation, and I would recommend him to you.
Okay. Those are the questions we have. We're getting ready to wrap up. There was a final question on receiving the PowerPoint. If you had registered in advance for this webinar, the PowerPoint was mailed to you. If you registered at the last minute, I may have not had an opportunity to get your name, but we'll send you the PowerPoint presentation afterward. If you would like it, feel free also to email me directly, and I will send the PowerPoint presentation to you. So Pam, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your valuable knowledge with us, and thank you all for joining NABCA on this webinar. If anyone has questions that we did not address or thinks of something afterward, feel free to email me. You should have my email address, maggie.barshini@nabca.org. Also, please feel free to visit the NABCA website, www.nabca.org, for various resources, including white papers, previous webinars, and other materials. We would like your feedback about this session, and will soon be sending you a quick survey to complete. So if you have any suggestions for future webinars, feel free to offer that to us as well. It is our goal to give you the education and tools that you need to perform your function effectively. Thank you all again for participating in today's webinar. Wishing everyone a great day. Goodbye.